The sound didn't belong in the forest. It came after midnight, when the camp had already settled into its routine. Gear stowed, perimeter set, radios low. 20 soldiers lay scattered beneath the trees, resting in short, disciplined intervals, the way they had been trained to do dozens of times before. Then someone lifted their head. At first, no one spoke. That was the rule. You listened first. You checked whether the sound repeated, whether it had a direction, whether it had a reason. The noise rose again from somewhere beyond the tree line. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough to ignore. A few of the men shifted in their sleeping bags. Others sat upright, eyes open, scanning darkness that gave nothing back. One soldier reached instinctively for his radio, then stopped. No contact yet, no confirmation, no reason to escalate. The sound carried through the forest in uneven bursts, not constant, not rhythmic. It didn't follow any pattern they recognized. Some thought it was human. That was the first assumption. Someone hurt, someone lost, someone in trouble deeper in the woods. Others weren't so sure. There was something about the way it echoed. Too rough, too strained, as if the sound wasn't being shaped by lungs the way it should have been. Procedure demanded patience, instinct demanded attention. The two didn't always agree. No one moved from their position. No one broke formation. The men listened, waiting for enough information to turn sound into action. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The forest closed back in on itself. Insects resumed their low, distant rhythm. Leaves shifted slightly in the night air. The moment passed, leaving behind only the awareness that it had happened at all. Eventually, the camp settled again. Sleep returned in fragments. The night continued as if uninterrupted. By morning, the forest would be silent. And silence, they would later say, was worse. The operation began in July of 2019 in the central Mexican state of Guanajuato. An area of mixed terrain, forests, low mountains, and scattered rural settlements. It had long been known as a corridor for small, concealed marijuana plantations, remote enough to avoid attention, accessible enough to exploit. The unit assigned to the mission consisted of 20 soldiers, not recruits, not ceremonial forces. Men with field experience, accustomed to operating in environments where visibility was limited and support was not always immediate. Their orders were clear and unremarkable. Locate illegal cultivation sites, secure the area, destroy the crops and any associated equipment. Avoid civilian contact where possible. Extract without drawing attention. This was not a raid. It wasn't an ambush. There was no intelligence suggesting armed resistance. No indication of hostages or forced labor. No expectation of prolonged engagement. Missions like this were routine. The soldiers moved light. Standard rifles, radios checked and rechecked. Night protocols reviewed before departure. Nothing experimental. Nothing improvised. Everything followed the book. They established camp the way they always did, choosing defensible ground, maintaining spacing, rotating watch in quiet, methodical shifts. Each man knew his role. Each movement had a reason. There was no sense of urgency beyond the schedule itself, no tension in the briefings, no warnings left unsaid. If anything, the assignment felt uneventful. That normalcy mattered. It meant that when something felt off later, it couldn't be dismissed as nerves or inexperience. These were soldiers who understood forests, understood night operations, understood how unfamiliar terrain behaves after dark. They had trained for confusion, for fatigue, for pressure. What they hadn't trained for was contradiction. A mission designed to remove something illegal from the land had, without warning, placed them in a situation that didn't belong on any operational checklist. At the time, none of them knew that. As far as the briefing was concerned, the mission made sense, and that, more than anything, is why the nights that followed would stay with them.
The finals didn't suddenly capture millions of new supporters. The system simply started counting more people. What ESPN hyped up as a massive breakthrough was really just data manipulation. Casual glances turned into viewership, and inflated numbers dressed up as real growth. Fans quickly started putting the puzzle together. If this really was the most watched finals since the 90s, why did it feel like nobody noticed? When a sporting event truly blows up, like the Super Bowl, March Madness, or even a random college bowl game, you can't escape it. Talk shows break down every play, social media explodes with memes and debates, and highlight reels flood every feed. But this time, silence. Even ESPN's own programs barely mentioned their so-called historic success. No viral moments, no trending clips, nothing. It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like something was being hidden. And when fans started comparing the buzz to other sports, things got even stranger. NASCAR, MLB, even mid-season football games all had way more online engagement despite pulling smaller audiences. That's when the cracks in the story became impossible to ignore. If the WNBA really drew 2 million viewers, where was the cultural reaction? More and more people began to wonder if those viewers weren't actually fans at all, but ghosts in the data. As backlash grew louder, even more troubling details surfaced. The official Nielsen report still hadn't been made public, leaving ESPN as the only source for the numbers. And that's when fans spotted the real issue. ESPN isn't just airing WNBA games, it's financially tied to the league. The WNBA's success directly boosts ESPN's profits through ads, sponsors, and brand deals. So the motivation to exaggerate those numbers, pretty obvious. Soon social media lit up. Reddit threads and X discussions accused ESPN of creating phantom viewers. Millions of supposed fans who somehow watched the game yet left zero footprint online. People started joking about ghost audiences, invisible fans that existed only on paper. Others compared it to Hollywood's box office tricks, inflating results to paint a picture of success, even when seats are empty. Before long, a new phrase started circulating in sports circles: manufactured success. By this point, ESPN and the WNBA had backed themselves into a corner. On paper, the numbers looked like a huge win, but in reality, the silence surrounding them was impossible to ignore. What was supposed to prove the league's growth had turned into a viral lesson in manipulation. Instead of celebrating progress, the WNBA was now facing embarrassment. And just when the debate seemed to reach its peak, a bigger truth came out. One that explained exactly how those ghost fans appeared in the first place. It all led back to Nielsen's new Big Data Plus system. On the surface, it was introduced to...
Morning came without incident. The light filtered slowly through the canopy, pale and uneven, revealing a camp exactly as it had been left the night before. No signs of intrusion, no disturbed ground, no indication that anything had moved through the perimeter. On the surface, everything appeared normal. It was the sound, or lack of it, that stood out. Forests are never truly quiet. Even at rest, there is movement. Insects, birds, wind passing through leaves, distant calls that give depth to the space. That morning, there was none of it. As the soldiers packed up camp, the only noise came from their own movements. Boots pressing into soil, equipment shifting against fabric, metal tapping softly against metal. No birds took flight, no insects stirred. The air felt heavy, unmoving, as if the forest itself were holding still. At first, no one commented on it. Silence, after all, isn't a threat by itself. But as the unit moved forward, the absence followed them. Step after step, the same quiet persisted. The forest didn't respond to their presence the way it should have. There were no startled animals, no distant rustling, not even the subtle background hum that usually filled the gaps between footsteps. The men didn't slow. They didn't spread out unnecessarily. They didn't raise weapons. They observed. This wasn't fear. It was comparison. They measured what they were experiencing against dozens of previous deployments, other forests, other regions, other nights and mornings that had followed familiar patterns. This one didn't. Someone finally broke the silence, not with alarm, but with a simple observation. It was quieter than it should be. No one disagreed. They continued their reconnaissance as ordered, scanning terrain for signs of cultivation, maintaining spacing, keeping their focus where it belonged. Yet the awareness lingered. The night before had introduced a sound that didn't resolve into anything tangible. The morning had answered with a silence that felt deliberate, almost corrective. By the time the sun climbed higher, the men understood one thing clearly. Experienced men notice patterns, and this one didn't belong. The second night began the same way as the first. Camp was established before sunset, perimeter secured, watches assigned with slightly more attention this time, though no one said why out loud. Procedures didn't change. They rarely did after a single anomaly. Darkness settled in, heavier than before. For a while, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, the sound returned. There was no confusion this time, no uncertainty about what they were hearing. The moment it surfaced, heads turned in unison toward the tree line. It was the same sound as the night before. Rough, strained, irregular, but it didn't feel as distant. It carried with more presence now, moving through the forest in shorter echoes, as if the space between the source and the camp had narrowed. Watches were tightened, radios stayed silent unless necessary. Fingers rested closer to triggers without touching them. No one broke formation, no one stepped beyond the perimeter. They listened. The sound rose in uneven bursts, cutting through the night air before falling away again. It never settled into a rhythm. It never revealed direction for long enough to be trusted. Attempts to track it only deepened the uncertainty. Each echo bent differently, deflecting off terrain in ways that made distance hard to judge. Still, no one moved. Discipline held. This wasn't panic. Panic is loud. Panic is chaotic. What filled the camp that night was restraint under pressure. Some of the men believed, quietly, that if the sound was human, revealing their position could make things worse. Others suspected that whatever was making the noise wasn't something they could approach without consequence. Neither interpretation led to action. The watch rotations continued. The sound came and went, hovering at the edge of certainty, close enough to command attention, far enough to deny response. Then, once again, it stopped. Not fading, not retreating, just gone. The forest resumed its muted presence, though not fully. The insects returned in fragments. The air shifted slightly, enough to signal that the moment had passed, but not enough to restore comfort. No shots were fired, no contact was made, no explanations were found. By morning, there would be no evidence that anything had approached the camp at all. Only the awareness that whatever they were hearing was not moving away. It was adjusting. By the third day, the mission itself was over. The plantation was located without incident. A concealed operation tucked into the uneven terrain, exactly where intelligence had suggested it would be. The crops were destroyed, equipment dismantled, the site rendered unusable. No resistance, no civilians, no signs that anyone had been present recently. From an operational standpoint, the assignment had gone as planned. With their objective completed, the unit began moving toward the designated extraction point. Rather than retrace their original path, the commanding officer ordered an alternate route. It was standard practice, a precaution meant to reduce the risk of ambush, even when none was expected. The terrain narrowed as the day wore on. Rock formations rose higher. Vegetation thinned in places, giving way to exposed stone and shallow ravines. As evening approached, they encountered the cave. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't deep enough to suggest danger at a glance. From the outside, it appeared exactly as many natural shelters did in that region. A broad opening carved by time and water, offering cover from multiple directions. The decision to stop there wasn't debated. The cave provided defensible positioning, natural barriers, overhead protection, clear lines of sight at the entrance. In fading light, it offered advantages that the surrounding forest no longer did. Tents were unpacked, sleeping bags laid out, security protocols established with the same precision they'd used every night before. Nothing about the choice felt impulsive. No one mentioned the sounds from the previous nights. No one needed to. They were already accounting for variables without naming them. Most of the men slept well that evening. The job was done. Extraction was ahead. The cave felt solid, predictable in a way the forest had stopped being. For those assigned to stand watch, the hours passed slowly but uneventfully. The entrance remained clear. The interior stayed quiet. The cave behaved exactly as expected, until it didn't. And when the sound returned, it wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It was close to 3 in the morning when the sound returned. Not outside, not beyond the perimeter, inside. At first, the men on watch thought the acoustics were playing tricks on them. Caves distort noise, they stretch it, fold it back on itself. A sound from outside can seem nearer than it is, but this wasn't bending, it was emerging. The sound rolled through the cavern in short, heavy bursts, echoing off stone walls that were now uncomfortably familiar. It carried weight, not volume but presence, as if it had space to move within. The realization spread quietly through the camp. No one said it out loud at first. They didn't need to. This wasn't something approaching the cave. It was already deeper inside. Men sat up. Hands reached for weapons. Others froze, listening harder than before, trying to locate distance by echo alone. The sound came again, clearer now, less distorted, close enough that its reverberation lingered along the rock, crawling back toward the entrance where they stood. Procedure demanded containment. If the source was human, sending help blindly into a confined space was dangerous. If it wasn't human, that thought went unfinished. The commanding officer made a decision quickly. Half the unit would remain at the entrance, securing the camp. The other half would move inward, locate the source, and confirm what they were dealing with. Not a pursuit, an assessment. Flashlights cut through the darkness, their beams sliding over damp stone and uneven ground. Water dripped steadily from above, punctuating the silence between echoes. Each step forward produced a dull scrape of boots against rock that felt louder than it should have been. For several moments, there was nothing. Just stone, just shadow, just the confined geometry of the cave pressing in. Then the light caught something that didn't match the walls. The surface was wrong. Not matte like stone, not reflective like water. It was slick. The beam moved again, tracing texture before form, scaled, uneven, subtly shifting as if responding to the light rather than reflecting it. The shape emerged in fragments. Height first, taller than a man standing upright. Then movement. Not aggressive, not retreating, but fluid in a way no human body moved in confined space. Another shape shifted beside it. Then another. No one fired. No one spoke. The figures adjusted, climbing easily over rock formations that should have slowed them. When the light lingered too long, they withdrew from it, shielding themselves without panic. The sound came again, louder now, and for the first time, it was unmistakably coming from them. Training covers many things. This wasn't one of them. What happened next unfolded faster than training could contain. The sound rose again, closer, sharper, and this time it triggered movement before thought could catch up. One of the figures shifted suddenly, crossing space in a way that broke every expectation of speed and weight. Discipline fractured. Someone shouted. Another stepped back too quickly, slipping on wet stone. A flashlight beam swung wildly, scattering shadows across the walls. Then a weapon discharged. The first shot wasn't aimed. It was reflex. More followed. According to those who survived, the rounds did what they were supposed to do. They struck their targets. The problem was what happened after. There was no visible reaction, no stumble, no slowing. The impacts didn't change the figure's movement in any meaningful way. Some soldiers later said the sound of bullets striking them was wrong, duller than expected, as if hitting something denser than flesh. The cave filled with overlapping noise, gunfire, echoes, shouted commands breaking apart under stress. The figures closed the distance, not charging, advancing with unsettling efficiency, using the terrain as if it were built for them. They climbed where humans couldn't, moved through narrow spaces without hesitation. Men ran. This wasn't retreat in formation. This was survival. In the confusion, soldiers fell. Not all of them got back up. Others were pulled from view, their absence noticed only when voices went silent where they shouldn't have. Those who reached the entrance didn't stop running. They burst into the open, shouting warnings that came out fragmented and incomplete. Inside the cave, the sounds continued for several seconds longer. Movement, impact, and something heavy shifting through stone before it all cut off at once. The survivors regrouped at the camp, weapons raised, breaths ragged. They tried to account for everyone. The numbers didn't add up. No one spoke about what they'd seen, not yet. They didn't need to. The cave entrance remained dark and still, as if nothing had happened within it at all. This wasn't a fight they had won. It wasn't even one they had understood. They hadn't escaped with answers. They had escaped with fewer men. The men who remained at the camp heard the gunfire before they saw anyone emerge. Short bursts, muffled by stone, then shouting, urgent, overlapping, unfinished. Weapons were raised. Defensive positions formed instinctively around the cave entrance. No one knew what was coming out of the darkness, only that something had gone wrong inside. Then the sound overhead cut through everything else. A helicopter. It appeared without warning, dropping low over the trees, its rotors compressing the air around the camp. The aircraft was matte black, absent of visible markings. No insignia, no identification lights beyond what was necessary to fly. It didn't announce itself. It hovered, then settled nearby, with practiced precision. Before anyone could react, 4 figures disembarked. They moved quickly, purposefully, dressed in dark, uniform equipment that didn't match any branch the soldiers recognized. Their helmets were sealed, visors polarized, obscuring faces completely. They spoke in firm, clipped commands: stand down, lower weapons, hold position. The voices carried through filters, distorted just enough to strip them of tone. Not raised, not aggressive, simply final. No credentials were shown, no explanations offered. And yet the authority was absolute. The soldiers complied. Later, some would say they didn't know why they listened, only that every instinct told them these orders weren't negotiable. The strangers moved through the camp as if they already knew its layout, stepping past men who moments earlier had been preparing to fight for their lives. Two of the figures advanced toward the cave without hesitation. The other two remained behind, watching the soldiers closely, weapons lowered but ready. Not defensive, observational. No one asked questions. The sounds from within the cave returned almost immediately. The same strained noise the soldiers had heard for 3 nights now, echoing violently against stone. Then came gunfire again. This time it was different, controlled, deliberate, short, efficient bursts that didn't scatter or overlap. The noise ended quickly. Silence followed. The forest seemed to wait. Minutes passed before the two figures re-emerged from the cave. They were dragging something behind them, and whatever it was, they didn't want it left behind. The two operatives who had entered the cave emerged several minutes later. They moved without urgency, as if the situation inside had been resolved completely. Between them, they dragged heavy shapes across the rock, forms wrapped and obscured enough that details were difficult to make out, yet solid enough to leave no doubt about their weight. The soldiers watched in silence. No one was ordered to assist. No one was allowed to approach. The remaining two operatives stepped forward and addressed the unit's commanding officer directly. Their posture was relaxed. Their weapons remained lowered. There was no attempt to intimidate. None was needed. They spoke clearly. They identified themselves as acting under the authority of the Mexican government. No department was named. No paperwork produced. The statement wasn't offered for verification. It was delivered as fact. They made it clear that they already knew the identities of every soldier present. Names, service records, assignments. Then came the warning. What had happened during the operation was not to be discussed. Not with superiors, not with family, not with anyone outside the detachment. There was no raised voice, no threat of immediate punishment. The consequences were implied, not explained. They didn't argue, they informed. The two wrapped forms were loaded onto the helicopter without ceremony, secured quickly, efficiently, as if this wasn't the first time such a procedure had taken place. The operatives boarded. The aircraft lifted off just as abruptly as it had arrived, disappearing back into the night. The camp was left exactly as it had been, except for the men who weren't there anymore. No debrief followed, no clarification arrived, no official record of the helicopter's presence was ever acknowledged. The soldiers stood in the darkness long after the sound of the rotors faded, weapons lowered, unsure whether the danger had passed or simply retreated. The cave entrance remained open, empty. Whatever had lived there was gone, and whatever authority had claimed it had left without explanation. The mission officially concluded the following day. The unit reached its extraction point without further incident. Reports were filed, equipment accounted for. The operation was marked as completed. No mention was made of the cave. In the weeks that followed, the detachment began to change. Several of the soldiers requested early discharge from military service. Some cited personal reasons. Others offered no explanation at all. Their requests were approved quickly, without the delays that usually accompanied such decisions. Those who remained were reassigned, not promoted, not disciplined. Simply moved, transferred to positions that kept them away from field operations, and in some cases, away from each other. Communication between former members of the unit dwindled, According to the researcher who later collected their accounts, many of the soldiers believed they were being watched, not followed openly, not confronted, just observed. Unmarked vehicles parked at a distance, familiar routes suddenly shared by the same faces, phone calls that dropped without reason. Whether these things were real or the result of lingering stress was never proven. What is clear is that when the soldiers agreed to speak, they did so under strict conditions. Names were withheld, details were filtered, locations generalized. Anonymity wasn't requested for attention, it was requested for safety. Those who had left the military found work elsewhere: private security, bodyguard services, roles that kept them close to weapons but far from questions. Those who stayed learned not to revisit that mission. There were no follow-up investigations made public, no inquiries acknowledged, no attempts to correct or clarify what had happened that night. The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Paperwork closed, files sealed, lives redirected. And for the men who had been there, the experience didn't become a story they told. It became something they carried quietly. Not because they wanted to, but because there was nowhere else to put it. The incident in Guanajuato was not presented as an isolated case. When researchers began comparing it to other reports, a pattern emerged. Not in details, but in behaviors that repeated across time and geography. One such account came from a highway in central California. In 2016, a former military serviceman reported seeing a tall, hooded figure walking along a remote stretch of road near Los Banos. At first glance, the sighting seemed almost mundane. Someone out of place, dressed for the wrong conditions. It was only when the witness saw the face that the encounter shifted. He described skin that didn't reflect light, like fabric or flesh. Features that appeared structured, not masked. Eyes that remained fixed and unblinking. The figure didn't approach. It didn't flee. It watched. Another account came from much earlier, passed down through an indigenous community in Mesoamerica. In the late 1950s, a young boy and several adults followed a descending light into dense jungle. They reported encountering a tall, scaled figure perched above them, partially concealed by foliage. When it moved, it did so with strength that seemed disproportionate to its size, dropping from height without injury and vanishing into deeper terrain. The details varied. The setting changed, but the behavior didn't. The figure didn't confront. It didn't communicate in language. It observed, repositioned, and withdrew. More recent reports describe the same tendency. Witnesses in rural areas of the United Kingdom have reported encounters with tall, reptile-like forms capable of climbing trees with ease, moving vertically in ways humans cannot, using branches and trunks as natural extensions of their environment. In these cases, the encounter often ends the same way. Once noticed, the figure doesn't escalate. It leaves. What connects these reports is not appearance alone, but pattern, remote locations, limited witnesses, brief exposure, uncertainty, and above all, the same consistent response to human presence: avoidance over confrontation, mobility over aggression. Taken individually, each account is easy to dismiss. Together, they raise a quieter question. Not what these things are, but how often they are seen, and how rarely they are recorded. None of these accounts offer proof in the strict sense. There is no footage that can be verified beyond doubt. No physical evidence made available for independent study. No official reports released that confirm what the witnesses believe they encountered. That absence matters. Extraordinary claims demand restraint, and every responsible investigation must begin with skepticism. Fear, stress, darkness, and unfamiliar terrain can distort perception. Memory changes over time. Stories can evolve without intent to deceive. Those realities can't be ignored, and yet, neither can the consistency. Across different countries, decades, and cultures, the same elements surface again and again. Encounters happen in remote areas. They are brief. The figures described are tall, difficult to observe clearly, and capable of movement that doesn't align with human limitations. Most telling of all is what follows: silence. Witnesses don't pursue attention. Many avoid speaking publicly for years. Some never do. When they do come forward, details are often restrained rather than embellished. In the case of the soldiers, the silence appears institutional. Procedures ended. Records stopped. Lives were redirected without explanation. In civilian cases, the silence is personal. People return home. They carry the experience quietly. They doubt themselves before asking others to believe them. This is where the story resists resolution. Patterns suggest something recurring. Proof remains absent. The space between those two facts is uncomfortable. But it's also where honest inquiry lives. Not in certainty, but in acknowledging that some events leave behind questions instead of answers. And that silence, repeated often enough, begins to feel less like coincidence and more like a response. This story isn't really about creatures in the dark. It's about the moments when systems designed to record everything suddenly don't. When an operation concludes cleanly on paper, yet leaves behind gaps no report addresses. 20 soldiers were sent into the forest to destroy something illegal and visible. They completed that task. What followed was something else entirely. Something that produced sounds without names, decisions without explanations, and orders that never appeared in writing. The forest returned to normal. The cave was left behind. The helicopter never existed in any official sense. What remained were people. Men who noticed patterns, men who followed procedure until procedure no longer applied. Men who learned that some experiences are not meant to be processed publicly. The unanswered sounds mattered less than what came after them. Reassignments without reason, resignations without protest, silence without denial. History is often shaped by what is documented, but it is also shaped by what is deliberately omitted. And sometimes the absence itself becomes the only evidence there is. If you look closely at stories like this, across different places and times, a similar shape emerges. Not of monsters roaming freely, but of boundaries, lines people cross without realizing it, spaces where oversight fades and responsibility changes hands. Whatever stayed underground that night wasn't just a presence in a cave. It was an explanation. If you have a theory, share it below. Some stories don't end. They just stop being spoken about.